My name is Loretta Finch, and if you stay with me long enough, you'll understand why I never needed to raise my voice to make the whole room go quiet. But before I tell you what happened at my son's housewarming party, the night everything shifted, I need to take you back to the moment I realized my daughter-in-law had decided I was nothing more than an embarrassment she had to manage. It was a Thursday evening in late October, the kind of evening where the cold comes in fast off Lake Ontario and the leaves on the street look like they've given up. My son called to say they'd bought a house. A real one, he said, as if every house before it had been pretend. Detached, 4 bedrooms, backing onto a ravine in Oakville. I was happy for him, genuinely happy. I asked if I could come see it before the party, maybe help set up. There was a pause, the kind that tells you more than any answer could. And then he said Renata had it handled. Renata, my daughter-in-law? I had tried with her. I want that on the record. I had brought food to their apartment when they first moved in together. Pierogies and a roast chicken, the kind of meal that says, I'm not trying to impress you, I'm just feeding you. She had thanked me with a smile that never reached her eyes and slid the containers to the back of the fridge without opening them. My son didn't notice. He rarely did where she was concerned. Where are you watching from today? I want to ask because what I'm about to tell you didn't just happen to me. It happens in kitchens and hallways across this country every single day to mothers who gave everything and found themselves quietly set aside when the new family was being assembled. The housewarming was on a Saturday, 60, maybe 70 people. Renata's side of the family moved through those rooms like they built the place themselves. Her mother, a sharp-dressed woman from Mississauga with opinions about everything and the confidence to deliver them without being asked, held court, knew the kitchen island. Her father laughed too loud at his own jokes. Her younger sister, who had never once spoken a full sentence to me in 3 years, floated around, refilling glasses and accepting compliments about the house as though she'd helped pay for it. I arrived at the door with a bottle of Niagara ice wine and a card. My son answered. He looked relieved to see me and slightly nervous at the same time, which was a combination I had learned to read over the years. He hugged me quickly and said Renata was just finishing up in the kitchen. Then he disappeared into a crowd of people I didn't know. I stood in the hallway, coat still on, holding my wine and my card, watching strangers move through my son's house like water through a familiar channel. No one introduced themselves. A few glanced at me and looked away. Renata came out of the kitchen eventually. She was dressed beautifully, she always was, and she looked at me the way you look at a piece of furniture you're not sure where to put. She took the wine without reading the label, handed the card to my son, and then, loud enough for the cluster of her relatives nearby to hear, she said, "Oh, good, you found us. We weren't sure you'd make it, with the drive and everything." I live 40 minutes away. In Brampton, I have driven that highway in worse weather than a clear October Saturday without incident for 30 years. But that's not what landed. What landed was the way her mother tilted her head and smiled, the way her sister covered a small laugh with her hand, the way my son looked at the floor. Renata continued, "We've got a spot set up for you over by the window. Nice and quiet. You'll be more comfortable there." The quiet corner, away from the main rooms, away from the conversation, tucked beside a rubber plant and a side table with coasters on it, positioned facing the backyard, with a direct line of sight to absolutely nothing of interest. I sat there for 20 minutes. I watched Renata's family photograph themselves in front of the fireplace, against the kitchen backsplash, in the doorway of the ravine-facing back deck. I watched my son laugh with her cousins and pour drinks for her father and orbit her like she was the sun and gravity was non-negotiable. And I sat by the window, a glass of someone else's Merlot in my hand, invisible. Then Renata's father decided to make a toast. He was standing near the center of the living room, glass raised, expansive in the way men are when they're performing generosity for an audience. He talked about Renata, how proud he was, how she had always known what she wanted and gone after it. He talked about the house, how it reflected her taste, her vision. He talked about my son as an extension of her accomplishments. A good man who was smart enough to hold on to her, he said. And everyone laughed. And then, with a sweeping gesture toward the room, he said, "And of course, all the family is here tonight, the people who matter." He did not look at me when he said it, but Renata did. Just for a second. A small, private glance. The kind that says that includes you out. The room applauded. My son raised his glass. And I understood, in the way you understand things that have been building for a long time without you wanting to name them, that I had not been invited to this gathering. I had been permitted to attend it. I finished my wine. I did not cry. I drove home on the 403 in the dark, and I thought about my husband, gone 11 years now, and what he would have said. He would have said, "Loretta, don't let them see it. Don't give them the satisfaction." He was a quiet man, steady as bedrock. He taught me that the best response to being underestimated is patience, so deep it looks like peace. And so I was patient. What Renata didn't know, what none of them knew, was the life I had built in the silence she found so easy to dismiss. I had worked as a commercial property assessor for 31 years. Started as a clerk for a small firm in Hamilton when my son was in grade school, learned the work from the inside out, and eventually became one of the most senior independent assessors in the region. I assessed industrial parks, strip malls, office towers, mixed-use developments across the Greater Toronto Area and out to Guelph and Kitchener. I knew what land was worth. I knew what buildings were worth. I knew what a good investment looked like years before anyone else did. I was widowed at 54. People assumed I would slow down. What they didn't see was that I sped up. I took the life insurance, combined it with savings I had been quietly accumulating since my 30s, and began to buy. Not flashy properties, not anything that would draw attention. A small commercial strip in Hamilton near the university, a unit in a mixed-use building in Guelph, two rental properties in Brantford, each one registered under a numbered company that meant nothing to anyone who didn't know to look. My son knew I owned some rental property. He assumed it was a modest side income, maybe to supplement my pension. I never corrected him. He never asked for details. I had learned by then that wealth shown too early becomes a target for the wrong kind of attention. I had watched it happen in other families. I did not want it to happen in mine. I also knew the area Renata's family was in. Her father, loud, generous, proud, ran a mid-size renovation contracting business that had expanded quickly during the pandemic years when everyone was redoing their kitchens and finishing their basements. He had borrowed heavily to grow. I knew his portfolio from professional circles. I had sat across from people who financed him at industry dinners. I knew the cracks. Even if he didn't know, I did. After the housewarming, I went home and I let the silence settle. And then, quietly, I began to move. The first step was a development parcel near Hamilton that Renata's father's company had been circling for 2 years. It was the kind of land deal that would have let him take his business to the next level. A large mixed-use project that would anchor his reputation in the region. He had been trying to assemble financing, to get the right partners in place. He was close. I knew because I had been watching it from a distance the way you watch weather patterns. I made a better offer, not through my own name, through one of my holding companies, clean and quiet, nothing to trace back to Loretta Finch of Brampton, Ontario. The seller chose me because my offer was cleaner and my financing was solid. No conditions, no delays. The deal closed in under 30 days. Renata's father didn't know what hit him. He assumed it was a competitor, some developer from out of town. He had no idea the parcel that would have made his company had just been bought by the woman he'd looked past at his daughter's housewarming. But that was only the beginning. The second move was my son's house itself. This one took longer and required more patience, but the situation presented itself with a kind of clarity that I chose to take as a sign. I learned, through an assessor colleague I trusted, that the original builder of that Oakville development had a remaining interest in several of the properties. A legacy clause in the original subdivision agreement that most buyers never knew to look for. It was obscure, it was legal, and when the builder's holding company ran into its own financing trouble and began selling off its remaining interests quietly, I bought them, including the one attached to my son's address. It didn't give me ownership of the house, but it gave me a significant secured position against the property's future refinancing options, which meant that if my son and Renata ever went to renew their mortgage or pull equity, which, given their spending, I expected they eventually would, my position would surface, and I would be in the room. I was patient. I had learned patience the hard way, through years of working in rooms where no one expected a widowed woman from Hamilton to know more than they did. I was used to being underestimated. I had made a career of it. My son called less that winter. I assumed Renata had something to do with that. The calls that came were brief, practical. Holiday logistics, a question about a recipe, a quick check-in that lasted 5 minutes before he said he had to go. I didn't push. I gave him the space he seemed to be choosing, and I waited. Renata's mother called me once. I want to be accurate about what she said. She called in February, warm in the way people are when they want something, and suggested that for everyone's sake, I might want to take a step back from expectations around family time. She said it delicately, with words like adjustment period and newlyweds finding their footing. But the message was clear. I was being managed. I was being reduced. I listened. I thanked her politely. I said I appreciated the conversation. Then I got off the phone and sat with what she'd said for a long time. There's a particular kind of grief that comes when you understand that the child you raised is allowing people to diminish you. It isn't rage. It's not even disappointment exactly. It's a slow, heavy realization that the connection you thought was permanent has been renegotiated without your knowledge and that you were not at the table when the new terms were set. I thought about my son at 7, sick with bronchitis, sleeping on my chest because he couldn't breathe lying flat. I thought about the years I drove him to hockey at 5 in the morning in weather that cracked the windshield, the years I worked overtime to make sure he had what he needed and what he wanted, and sometimes what he simply wished for. I thought about the night he called me from university at 2 in the morning, crying about a girl, and I sat in my kitchen in the dark and talked to him until he fell asleep on the phone. I thought about all of it, and then I thought, patience, Loretta, not because they deserve it, because you know what's coming, and it will say everything that needs to be said. Spring arrived. Renata's family began planning what they were calling a family milestone celebration, essentially a large dinner party at the Oakville house, marking the 1-year anniversary of the purchase. Invitations were sent. Renata's sister organized a catered menu. Her father was, from what I heard secondhand, planning remarks about legacy and family success. I was invited. Late, and briefly my son texted me the details with a message that read like Renata had composed it for him. But I was invited. I came. I dressed in the same understated way I always do. Slacks, a good blouse, my late husband's watch. Nothing that asked for attention. I brought flowers, freesias, because I have always brought freesias, and I was not about to change. The house was full. The catered food was elegant. Renata moved through her guests like a woman who had spent years rehearsing for exactly this life. Her mother beamed. Her father, holding court near the dining room entrance, spoke to everyone except me. My son found me at the drink table and squeezed my arm. He said he was glad I came. I believed him. I also believed he had been talked to about how the evening should go and that my presence in it was, at best, a concession. Dinner was served. Toasts began. Renata's father went first, as expected. He was eloquent, credit where it's due. He spoke about the house, about his daughter, about the future. He gestured warmly at his son-in-law, my son, and said he had earned his place in the family. And then, raising his glass to the table, he said what he always said, in slightly different words, to the people who built this, and the family that will carry it forward. His gaze swept the table. It landed briefly on me and then moved on without stopping, the way you glance at a corner where nothing interesting is happening. My son looked at his plate. I waited until the room had resettled, until the conversation had broken into smaller currents and people were refilling glasses and cutting into the food, and then I said calmly, to no one in particular and everyone at once, "I have something I'd like to say, if that's all right." The table quieted. People looked at me, some curious, some uncertain, some, like Renata's mother, with the careful blankness of someone prepared to redirect. I stood. "This is a beautiful house," I said, "and I'm glad it exists because it brought us all here tonight." I paused. "I want to say something about this property, actually, because there's something about this that I think is relevant." Renata looked at my son. My son looked at his hands. "When you purchased this home," I continued, "there was a legacy interest held by the original development company. Most buyers don't know to look for it. It doesn't affect ownership, but it affects refinancing options significantly, particularly when you're looking at pulling equity or renegotiating terms." I let that settle. "That interest was sold off last year when the builder restructured. I bought it." Silence. Not uncomfortable silence, stunned silence, the kind that precedes understanding. "Which means," I said, still calm, still standing, "that when the time comes to refinance this house, and I understand that's been discussed, I will be one of the parties at the table." Renata's father put down his fork. "I also purchased the development parcel near Hamilton that was part of your expansion plans," I said, looking at him directly for the first time all evening. "Through a holding company. I believe your team was in negotiations for about 18 months." The color left his face so quickly it was almost like watching a tide go out. "I'm not telling you this to cause harm," I said. "I'm telling you because I have been quiet in this family for 3 years. I have been seated by windows and spoken to like a scheduling problem, and introduced to rooms like a guest who showed up without an invitation. I have been managed and minimized and treated as though my only function was to occasionally be tolerated." I looked at my son. His eyes were wet, and I stayed quiet. Not because I had no voice, but because I was waiting to use it at the right time. I sat down. The room did not move for a long moment. Then Renata's father said something low and sharp in a language I didn't speak, and her mother reached across the table to touch his hand, and Renata pressed her fingers to her mouth, and my son looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since he was a child and had realized I had known about something he tried to hide. Not anger, not shame, exactly, but the specific face of someone understanding that the person across from them knows far more than they ever let on. I stayed for dessert. Tart au sucre, catered, very good. I had 2 pieces. The weeks that followed were difficult for everyone in different ways. Renata's father spent considerable time on the phone with his solicitor trying to understand how a numbered company he'd never heard of had beaten him to the Hamilton parcel. He reached out through my son, awkwardly, through messages forwarded like hot objects nobody wanted to hold, trying to open a conversation. I responded politely and said I was open to discussion at the appropriate time. Renata was quiet in a way she had never been quiet before. The confidence she wore like a second skin seemed to need adjusting. I heard from my son that she had asked him questions he couldn't answer about my background, my finances, my work history. She had apparently assumed I was a retired civil servant. He had apparently assumed the same. He came to see me alone on a Tuesday, which was new. No text first, just a knock at the door at 6:30. I made tea. He sat at my kitchen table the same way he had sat there at 7, at 12, at 16, with his elbows on the wood and his hands wrapped around the mug and his eyes trying to figure out where to land. He said he hadn't known. I said I knew he hadn't. He said he was sorry. I said I knew that too, and that sorry had a different weight when it came with changed behavior, not just changed feelings. He didn't argue. He sat with it, which told me more than any apology could. I told him the truth then, not all at once, because truth delivered all at once overwhelms rather than teaches, but enough. Enough for him to understand that the woman he had let be redirected to the corner by the rubber plant was not diminished by that corner. She had simply been waiting. Renata came to me 3 weeks later, alone, a Saturday morning, no heads up, a bottle of Niagara Peninsula Chardonnay in her hand, a better label than I'd ever brought to her. She stood at my door looking like someone who had rehearsed something and then decided at the last second not to say it. We sat at my kitchen table. We didn't talk for a while. Eventually she said, "I think I misread you." I said, "Yes." She said, "I didn't. I didn't mean for it to feel the way it did at the party, at the housewarming." She stopped, started over. "I think I wanted Marcus to be more mine than his family's, and I thought that meant another stop." I let her sit in the unfinished sentence. Then I said, "A man doesn't become more yours by making his mother less his. That's not how families grow. That's how they fracture." She looked at the table. "I'm not asking you to love me," I said. "I'm not asking for anything tonight, but I want you to understand something." I waited until she met my eyes. I built what I built in complete silence. I did it while raising a son alone and grieving a husband and working a career that nobody in your family circles thought to ask about. And in all of that, the only thing I wanted from your family was to be seen, not celebrated, just seen." She was quiet for a long time after that. When she left, she said thank you, not in the reflexive way, the way people say it when they're leaving a room. She said it slowly, the way you say something you mean, but aren't completely sure you've earned the right to say yet. I watched her car pull out of my driveway. The oak at the edge of my yard was starting to bud, small, pale green, the tentative beginning of something. I thought about my husband, about the early years, about the long thread of choices that had brought me to this particular Tuesday morning in Brampton, holding a mug of tea and watching my daughter-in-law drive away in a car I could have bought outright and hadn't, because it would have changed nothing that needed to be changed. The lesson was never about the money. The money was just what happened when you paid attention for a long time and made careful decisions and refused to panic. The real thing, the thing that mattered, was that I had never let them convince me I was what they thought I was. They thought the corner by the window was a place to put something you didn't want to deal with. I thought of it as a very good vantage point. My son calls every Sunday now. We talk for a long time. About his work, about the house, about nothing in particular. Renata sends food sometimes. A container of something she's made, left on my step with a note that's getting slightly warmer each time, the way late spring weather does. Gradually, and then all at once. I don't need her to love me. I never needed that. I needed her to see that I was someone worth considering. And on the day she stood at my door with that bottle of wine, uncertain and unscripted and genuinely herself for the first time since I had known her, she finally did. That was the day I stopped being the woman in the corner and became the one who had quietly held the room all along. I still think about that rubber plant sometimes, the one they put me next to at the housewarming. I don't think Renata chose it deliberately. That's the thing about being dismissed by people who don't see you as a threat. There's no malice in it. There's something almost worse than malice. There's indifference. And indifference, I've come to understand, is what happens when someone has already decided you don't matter enough to think about carefully. What I know now, looking back at those 3 years, is that everything that happened followed a straight and honest line of cause and effect. Renata's family treated me the way they did because they read the surface and stopped there. They saw a widowed woman from Brampton in sensible clothes who brought flowers to parties, and they made their conclusions and stopped asking questions. That's not cruelty. That's a failure of curiosity. And a failure of curiosity, in my experience, costs people more than almost any other mistake they can make. Her father lost the Hamilton parcel because he moved loudly and assumed that confidence was the same thing as preparation. I moved quietly and made sure my paperwork was cleaner than his by a considerable margin. That's not luck. That's what happens when you spend 30 years paying attention in rooms where no one expected you to be paying attention. I had built something real, slowly, by understanding things as they actually were, rather than as I wished them to be. He had built something impressive, quickly, by betting that the performance of success would hold long enough for the substance to catch up. Marcus, my son, he had to sit with his own choices too. Not dramatic ones, not cruel ones. Just the small, accumulated choices of a man who had let someone he loved slowly reframe the people around him without pushing back. He wasn't a bad son. He was a son who had gotten comfortable. And comfort, when it comes at the cost of someone else's dignity, is its own kind of failing. When he came to my door on that Tuesday evening, he didn't come with excuses. He came with tea and elbows on the table and the willingness to sit with something uncomfortable until it became something true. That mattered to me more than any apology could have. What I want to say, what I think about when I'm sitting with my morning coffee and the oak in the yard is doing whatever it's doing in whatever season we're in. Is that the three things that actually carried me through this were not complicated. They were just steady. The first was knowing the difference between right and wrong and holding to it even when no one was watching. I didn't buy that parcel to punish him. I bought it because it was a good investment and it was available and I was ready. The ethics of it were clean. That matters. You have to be able to look at your own choices in the morning. The second was using my mind honestly, not to win arguments or prove points, but to understand things clearly and act on that understanding. Knowledge that you don't act on is just decoration. Knowledge that you've done the work to earn, really earn, not inherit or assume. That becomes the kind of quiet resource that holds up under pressure. The third was the willingness to keep going through the years when nothing showed on the surface. The early mornings, the drives to properties in places nobody thought were worth looking at, the patience through interest rate changes and difficult tenants, and a grief that sat in my chest for longer than I ever admitted to anyone. That persistence wasn't stubbornness. It was a decision made and remade every morning that I was not finished yet. The corner by the window had a very good view of the backyard, as it turned out. I could see the whole ravine from there, and the whole room,